The most promising trend in Asia today, I think, is the increased interconnections among Asian societies and also the increased interconnections between Asian countries and the world. You can call it globalization if you like. I prefer to think of it as a thickening of connections and a increase in flows of people, goods, ideas. And I think this is the most promising trend today.
The most promising trend's the really obvious one. It's just the spectacular improvement in living standards. It is such a hugely positive thing to see so many people being lifted out of poverty at such a rapid rate. Now, we're all familiar with that that's what's going on, but we also take it for granted. And it has just such fundamental consequences for the well-being in people's lives, and then all sorts of flow-on effects. So, in my mind, without question, that's the really positive trend.
The most promising trend in Asia today over the last decade or so has been the empowerment of people through the democratization of countries such as Indonesia. This has enabled, in the Indonesian case, people to take a lot more control over their life. It's been empowering for the media. It's been empowering for people in some parts of the economic sphere. Whether or not the reformers are going to win out in all of these cases remains to be seen. There's a huge contestation now between people who are fighting for further political economic reforms and social justice, and vested interests who would prefer the status quo to remain the same. But I think that is one of the most exciting things that we've seen.
Yeah, the exciting trends that give me reason for optimism, and I think there are two big ones, and that the first is democratization, and the second is a diminution of conflict and war. You know, if you look just at the last year or two on both of those trends, there's a lot of reasons to be pessimistic, actually. We've seen, political conflict in Thailand, for example. We've seen deterioration of democracy in some of the countries of Southeast Asia. There's political conflict and violence in many countries around the region. But if we go back, 2 or 3 decades, we've seen really positive moves forward right across the region, both in South Asia, Southeast Asia, which is where I work, and Northeast Asia. Academics like myself often concentrate on the day-to-day developments in politics across the region, and in virtually every country in the region, of course, there are reasons for concern. But if you step back just to the kind of medium-term historical trends, the last 2 to 3 decades, both in terms of transitions from authoritarian to democratic rule, and in terms of diminution of armed conflict, I think there's a lot of reasons to be very optimistic.
The growth of information that is available to all sorts of people in Asia, where it wasn't available before, a growing global sophistication, if you will, which can have varying impacts depending on whether your life overall is a good one or isn't a good one. In other words, are you getting what you know is available, or aren't you getting what you know is available? But in all cases, there are ideas of what's out there, which I think is a vast change from earlier perceptions among ordinary people.
One of the greatest positive trends is the way in which China has been able to develop peacefully over the past 3 decades or more, lifting millions of people out of poverty, managing a huge population, huge transitions, and being able to sort of engage with neighbours and with the rest of the world on the basis of a multilateral approach. And there was a lot of concern, I think, a couple of decades ago, that China wouldn't buy into multilateralism, that it would be really too much concerned with itself, with its domestic challenges, and of course fear that multilateralism was really a rich country's game, that they wouldn't be able to gain from working at a cooperative level on a multilateral basis, because it would always be the Western nations with the power who would be the winner and they would be the loser. And of course there's historical reasons for that fear as well. But in fact what we have seen is much more engagement from China, particularly over the past decade, a very firm commitment to multilateralism. And that is a positive development. I'm not saying it's all good, but in general, the general overall longer-term trend, I think, is positive. And we should remind ourselves of that when we start to look in specific areas and specific cases and contexts in which we see more tensions and frictions.
It has to be China's continued integration into the global economy through its trade and investment links, and playing by those global rules in the trade realm through the WTO, mostly.
The most promising trend in Asia today is the success of what we may call, following the Burmese economist Lamian's terminology, the success of the outward-looking development strategy in Asia. This was initiated by the so-called Gang of, what we call the Gang of Four, with allusion, of course, to Madame Mao, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. They first developed from the 1960s this very successful outward-looking development strategy that, as we know, was followed by Deng Xiaoping in 1979 with remarkable success for China in the last 30 years, and India, which ignored the experience of the lesser, smaller East Asian economies. I recall being told by an Indian civil servant, a very distinguished Indian civil servant, you know, Professor Findlay, those are small economies. How can India follow such a large economy like India follow such a strategy? But when China successfully pursued that very same strategy for 10 years, in 1990, India decided that, well, they better follow the same strategy too. And so we have the two giants, the two Asian giants, which had been, mired in either in stagnation and even catastrophe in the case of China, and a very modest rate of growth in the case of India. We have all of a sudden in the last 30 years this enormous progress of China and India leading the world in economic growth, exports, and so on.
My research focuses on Burma, and specifically the ongoing ethnic conflict, or the longest-running civil war in modern history. And so there's been a lot of recent trends in opening up potential democratization, changing in censorship laws, freedom of association, and a lot of eyes are on Burma for some real, actual, concrete improvements in the situation for the people there. So that's something that's really exciting just recently.
I think the most promising one probably has to do with the economic interdependence that's been on the rise in the last, say, 10, 15 years. Because the flow of trade, personnel, information, and that really helps the, not integration, but certainly the kind of interdependence. I always say the interdependence that among the Asian countries, I think the economic and trade interdependence that among the Asian countries really is the most positive, if you will, of the development. The other side also, I have to say, as a political scientist, I do notice that in countries, especially in Asia, where authoritarian regimes still in power, but I do see that kind of change that possible happen in the next 10 years or so. That is, even with China, which is, has been long been regarded as, economic reform without political change. I think China has come to the crossroad, come to the point where political reform has to be done, and some changes has to be taken place. And so I see that as a positive sign. Granted, that change, we don't know yet whether there will be violent, will be, rapid dislocation, rapid, kind of a short-term chaos or not. Hopefully not, but hopefully that the change will be peaceful. But I certainly see that change will going to take place in the next 10 years or so.
As someone who's worked specifically on human rights instruments and international law, I think it's a particularly interesting time to be looking at how Asia is responding to international law norms around human rights through the development of regional instruments, through responses to international human rights questions that go beyond a perhaps blanket or a blunt statement around cultural practices that delimit that, and also responses, increasingly sophisticated responses from the West about how cultural practices and understandings of rights might indeed shift between cultures across the world. And so what's interesting for me perhaps is how the particular ways in which Asian countries have resisted international rights norms are being rethought through in the contemporary period.
There's no question what's exciting about Asia is the people it's sending to work with us and the students that Asia is sending to study with us. These change really term by term. You see a more and more interesting and thoughtful and well-resourced and more open-minded kind of person, young person coming from Asia.
I think one of the most promising trends has been the success of economic reform and political reform across the region, which has enabled hundreds of millions of people to rise out of poverty. And for someone who's been visiting China for many years, over the last 15 years, I've been visiting China, and I've seen the way in which economic development and economic successes have really transformed people's lives and created opportunities for a new generation of people across China. But this is also happening across Southeast Asia and India and South Asia.
My research is about transnational feminist linkages. So one of the things that I think about in Asia is where are there spaces and who is mobilizing around gender equality issues. And so for me, one of the most promising trends is the fact that there is a lot of mobilizing at the very local level. There are women's groups, there are organizations, there are civil society and government-placed people that are meeting and talking about issues in a way that we in the U.S. do not talk about. They're debating particular kinds of equality issues, both from a gender perspective, but also intersecting with ethnicity, with religion, with global location, the languages they speak. And to me, that for a researcher, for a scholar, and for a teacher, it's really exciting to see, because I can bring that into my classrooms in a way that my students here in the US otherwise wouldn't have any knowledge of. And it helps them think about their own global location and what they can contribute to that, what they can learn from that for their own experiences, whether or not they ever intend to live in Asia or work in Asia. It does affect how they think about their space in the US as well.
I think it's the opportunity for increased interconnection among social movements. The opportunity for those that are concerned about such things as quality of democracy, how to make democratic structures real and have content, how to allow those democratic structures to provide opportunities for those that are disadvantaged. For people to start to be able to interact with each other on that issue. Secondly, for those that are concerned about issues of economic inequality, for those who have similar ideas about that, to be able to start to interact with each other more. And thirdly, over environmental kinds of concerns, as these are shared broadly, different issues from one country to the next. And it's often new technologies that provide an opportunity for those kinds of interchanges that haven't been there before.
So this is not so much something I research myself, but it's something I've observed in the process of doing my research, and it's the youth and the kind of broad domestic or international education that they're getting. And it's really exciting to think about them being the future in Asia, right? So these are kids that either I've met in different parts of Tibet that come from all over the Tibetan regions and are getting great educations in China, but in this kind of multilingual, they're not just Tibetan focused, they learn Chinese, they learn English, and they're exposed to a lot of great ideas. And then they go out back to their villages, right? They don't just flee to the US or abroad, even though this often gives them the opportunity, might give them the opportunity to. They take this knowledge that they get back to their village. And then also here through graduate level instructions, I see a lot of Chinese, mostly Chinese, fewer Tibetans coming here and learning about Tibet here in the West, and then planning to actually take that knowledge back. And I'm hearing more stories through colleagues and so forth, but this broad education that the youth is getting gives me a lot of hope for the future.
The most promising trend is the fact that economic growth has been going on, and that growth has delivered poverty reduction. I'm not very interested in what happens to the rich people in the societies of Asia. They're fine already. It's the really poor people whose consumption of goods and services is important, and economic growth has delivered benefits to those people measured in absolute terms. Absolute poverty reduction has declined in all of the economies that have been growing, and the rate at which poverty has come down has been highly correlated with the rate of growth. Short-term fluctuations in growth correspond to fluctuations in the rate at which poverty declines.